if you go overboard on any aspect of yoga or on a combination of methods of yoga, you're liable to stimulate too much purification and opening in the nervous system, and that can lead to some discomfort, and then you have to back off and self-pace your practice.
So how extensive should the practice be? So I know it's 2 short sets a day, how many asanas would you say? And of course, we don't need to go into all of what they are, but whatever you think is important.
Well, in the AYP books that cover this, we have about a dozen postures, and it's just very basic bending and stretching, and most of those will be quite familiar to anybody who's taken a basic yoga class. We don't get into advanced postures, although that's certainly an option for anybody that wants to incorporate them, which can even be done in a short routine. But we use them before pranayama and a deep meditation. So the routine we're talking about is about a dozen postures, and it takes 5 to 10 minutes.
Oh, that's
it.
That's really great.
That's it.
Yeah.
And some people do more. Some people do 20 or 30 minutes. People who come from a long background of asanas who are listening here are going to say, "Oh, this isn't significant." But to people who have a lot of experience with asanas, I would say, well, are you also doing pranayama and deep meditation?
Yes.
And if the answer is no, I would suggest to consider trying to balance those 3 practices just to begin with, because the results from an asana routine and a pranayama routine and a deep meditation routine, all of which can be done together in about 30 or 40 minutes, those results will be much more dramatic than doing just asanas alone for 30 or 40 minutes. So that would be my suggestion to people who have been doing asanas for long periods of time over many years. Not that there's anything wrong with that. It's really just a question of, do you want to move on and provide means for purification and opening throughout your entire spiritual neurobiology within you.
So what do you mean when you say our nervous system determines the practice? How does this happen?
Well, as beings, we are wired for spiritual evolution. And it goes from our grossest physical level down into our subtle neurobiology, into our emotional body, which is connected to our physical nervous system, and our mind. And beyond all of that, we are silence. We are pure bliss consciousness. So anybody that's done an asana routine knows that there's a relaxation and some stillness that comes with that. Then if you sit down and do some pranayama, spinal breathing pranayama in particular, as we've discussed two interviews ago, you'll find even more relaxation coming. It's sort of picking up on where the asanas leave off and going deeper with more relaxation in the subtle neurobiology. And then with deep meditation, you go much deeper to stillness beyond thinking and feeling in the body. And that's the experience that you want to infuse in your life, that stillness, that silence.
Yes, with all of these practices, I think balance is probably the key to the success of yoga.
It is, because we're highly complex and diverse beings with these many capabilities on many different levels. So it stands to reason that if we want to stimulate ourselves as a whole towards human spiritual transformation, to live a life of peace and creativity and harmony and all of that, we should be pulling the levers across the spectrum of our capabilities, and then they all work together.
Now let's look at mudras. They're not so well known. It's almost like we're learning a new language when we're looking into this spiritual path. We're learning words that are not familiar to us in the West. But so can you tell us what they are exactly? What are mudras?
Yeah. Well, mudras and bandhas are subtle physical movements or internal physical movements that we do to further the process on a physical level raising the ecstatic nature in the body. We call it developing ecstatic conductivity, because essentially what you're doing is you're stimulating the ecstatic nature in the body, and then you're doing things that will allow it to naturally conduct throughout the body, and then beyond the body as well. So mudras and bandhas are for that, and there's about about 10 or 12 that we cover in AYP. Some of the most important ones. But before I say that, let me say also that yoga postures, the primary purpose of them from a spiritual point of view is to condition the body from the point of view of the spinal nerve. We've talked about the spinal nerve when we covered spinal breathing pranayama, which also traverses the spinal nerve, the spinal area. Asanas, if you consider the yoga postures that you've been doing, they always have to do with the spine, either bending, forward, backward, twisting. It's all conditioning of the spinal nerve, because when that opens up, that's when ecstatic conductivity begins to move. So asanas have to do with this ecstatic awakening also, but mudras and bandhas are more focused. And some of the more better-known ones, for example, Sambhavi Mudra, which we touched on a little bit when we covered spinal breathing pranayama. It's just gently raising the eyes toward the point between the eyebrows, putting a little bit of a flex in there in the frontal part of the brain. And what that does is it stimulates the neurobiology in the brain, which is directly connected down through the spinal nerve all the way to the root. Another maneuver that we use, which is at the other end of the spinal nerve, is called Mula Bandha, which is a bandha, which is the compression of the anal sphincter and the perineum area, which is the other end of the spinal nerve. Those two are the first two that we cover in AYP once we have a good routine of deep meditation and spinal breathing and asanas going on. And what those two maneuvers do is they begin to stimulate the spinal nerve on both ends, which helps awaken it ecstatically.
Oh, that's exciting.
And then we have other ones that are up and down that are also working on this ecstatic awakening. So that's what mudras and bandhas are about, basically.
And what is a whole body mudra?
Well, for someone who's been practicing these things for a while, along with meditation and spinal breathing and the postures and, some other things that we cover, the body tends to become naturally ecstatic and radiant. And these movements, these internal movements, the mudras and bandhas, they tend to become very refined, where you're like doing this big compression or this big thing with the eyes or a big anything. They become very subtle and very delicate, and they are essentially responding to the energy flow, the ecstatic energy flow in the body. And then they all begin to work together. Just the way the 8 limbs of yoga work together, the mudras and bandhas naturally begin to work together when a person has inner silence coming up from meditation and ecstatic conductivity coming up from the asanas and mudras and bandhas and pranayama. And then they all work together very subtly. And that working together of all the mudras and bandhas I call whole body mudra, because then you may raise your eyes a little bit, and then your just whole body goes into this sort of mode of ecstatic conductivity, and that's a whole body thing.
Yes.